I'm Ann Van Fossen from the Classical Learning Resource Center. Welcome to our webinar, Why Should My Child Prepare for the ACT and SAT? Presenting this webinar is Dr. Mark Tarpley. Dr. Tarpley has been involved in education, course design, and test preparation work for over 20 years, has spent much time with many different students helping them to prepare successfully for standardized tests. So thank you very much, Dr. Tarpley, for joining us today. We look forward to hearing your experience with test preparation and how important that is for college admissions.
Thank you so much, Ann, for having me. By way of introduction, just with a little more background, I started originally doing test prep when I was in college. My mom was an elementary school teacher. My dad was a university professor. And so when I was in undergrad, I thought, well, I'm a home of educator, so I'll make some money doing test prep for students. And that kind of carried with me when I was teaching in public and private schools. And then in 2014, formalized a company of my own to service families in preparation for these exams. And so just as we get started, I would remind you that if you have questions as we go, there is the chat box for Q&A. Feel free to drop in the questions, and then at the end I'll try to address the questions that have been offered. So let's begin just with an overview. We'll spend just a little bit of time, not an exhaustive amount of time on these different parts. And then again, the Q&A can sometimes be extremely helpful to kind of drill in. So we're going to start with what the ACT and SAT are not. Then we'll move to, so why prep for these tests? Then we'll talk about how we have to exit the classroom and enter the test zone. And then we'll talk about what does responsible preparation look like, and what does quality preparation look like. And then at the end, obviously, we'll need to offer a few thoughts on COVID-19 and the ACT and SAT and what's going on right now in relationship to these exams and college admissions. So let's begin with what the ACT and SAT are not. Okay. And as someone who actually runs a company prepping people for these tests, sometimes people are surprised to hear this portion of any presentation. But first, these tests do not define a person. Okay, and secondly, these tests do not measure a person's intelligence. These are extremely important. When I work with families and students, I try to really emphasize these up front to give context to the nature of these tests and the context in which we should think about these tests from my perspective. Now, I think most of us know that these tests should not define a person or a student. And I think that point's obvious enough. But what I have found over the years is that this idea can emerge in kind of strange ways in relationship to the student's relationship with peers and relationship with parents. And so I'm just going to give you some brief examples of that. So oftentimes students can put tremendous pressure on themselves. They can set unrealistic goals. They can set expectations for themselves. And then these tests become a huge barrier to them achieving those goals or even score goals on themselves. And in that sense, they're maybe not holding a healthy relationship to these tests. Certainly peers in relationship to peer pressure, or what did you get on this test, or what college are you going to? So there's a whole set of relationships that can sometimes become complicated with peers. And then also parents actually is often the one that's the most complicated, I've found over the years. And it's usually unknowingly, where there's tremendous stress placed on a child by the parent with something as simple as, you're going to have to get a lot of scholarships if you're going to go to college, so you've got to score high on this test. Well, that can come like a really impactful statement by parents. And so the student can really begin to identify themselves in relationship to their score, which at the end of the day doesn't help them grow their score and certainly doesn't maintain a healthy relationship. So the first one is how these tests do not define a person, a cautionary point there. And the second cautionary point is these tests do not measure a person's intelligence. Okay, well, what exactly do I mean by that? Well, let's unpack that a little bit more, because I think this is incredibly important to understand about these tests, both in terms of what value they actually offer a student and a family, and then also in terms of how you actually prepare for these tests. So we're gonna dive into this question for just a second. Neil Postman, an important social critic in the 1980s and 90s, defines intelligence this way: a general term used to denote one's capacity to solve real-life problems in a variety of novel contexts. I'm going to repeat that. a general term used to denote one's capacity to solve real-life problems in a variety of novel contexts. So no doubt humans are complex, and so is intelligence. Now, Neil Postman further writes, the idea that a quantitative value should be assigned to human thoughts was a major step toward constructing a mathematical concept of reality. If a number can be given to the quality of a thought, then a number can be given to the qualities of mercy, love, hate, beauty, creativity, intelligence, even sanity itself. In other words, what Neil Postman is trying to get at here is intelligence is a qualitative reality, which, similar to love, we ought not to define in terms of numbers. But why we are willing to accept such a quantitative view of the world is a really important question. I think a lot of it has to do with, in general, our society believes that numbers can express authentic knowledge. Of course, those from a pre-modern worldview would have been absolutely confounded by such a claim. In response to a pre-modern worldview that would have rejected the idea of measuring qualitative realities such as intelligence or love with numbers, people today may ask, how then can you measure a student's progress? Or how do we rank a student? And of course, the answer ought to be that you can't measure something so complex on a linear scale, for example, of the ACT of a 1 to 36. For example, then, what exactly is the ACT testing? Right? We want to say it's measuring a student's propensity to perform well in college, their intelligence. And I'll actually address this question a little bit later. And I think what we can say is it's not really measuring a child's intelligence. And so it's important to understand first from a test prep perspective, but also just, I think, a healthy cultural perspective. What do these tests really measure? These tests may say they're measuring math skills or punctuation, grammar, and usage. But in my 20 years of experience, they don't really test those things. That's not the primary aim. The primary aim is, can a student manage stress? Can they do very specific problem-solving skills related to multiple choice questions? And do they know how to manage time? And then secondarily, and at a very, very basic level, can they manage classroom content? So we could ask the question, why do we privilege these types of skills to the exclusion of all other kinds of skills? And how do we meaningfully assign numbers to intelligence? Well, the only way is by us accepting the test without questioning the presuppositions of the test that are hidden within the test. So I think we ought to, at a minimum, be very aware of what we are engaging when we're taking these tests. So we see that these tests neither define who a person is, nor do they measure the intelligence of a student. And if this is the case, why in the world should we actually prep for these tests? Which is a really important question that I think every family needs to think deeply about. Okay. So why prep for these tests? Well, there's two reasons. There's college admissions and there's scholarships. And these should not be confused. In fact, when we get to the COVID-19 discussion, just some thoughts there, we're going to need to make sure that we separate these two spaces out well, because they're not necessarily the same thing. And what I mean by that is these tests help you get into college, or they may not, and they offer scholarships, or they may not. They're not exactly the same conversation. Okay, so let's start with just a basic, let's say pre-COVID-19 example. Generally, when you apply to a college, they're looking at your GPA, your grade point average, your ACT or SAT scores. Here I'm just talking about ACT, and your activities. You know, are you play violin? Are you involved in sports? Do you do community service? These types of things. But the reality is, in higher education, almost every school starts with numbers to batch students. So this pie that represents 3 equal parts really isn't typically so equal within a school. In fact, you have kind of the gateway entry, which is usually your ACT, SAT score, and your GPA, which oftentimes, depending on if you're in a school or homeschool, produces a class rank. In other words, it's numerically based, and then once it's numerically based, then they bucket you. And for the most part, there's efficiency there. If you're like let's say, University of Texas in Austin with, tons and tons of applicants, how do you sort them all? How do you bucket them? You're looking for an avatar, a type of student you're trying to get admitted. You're not really interested in a specific student. So, there's a lot going in here into this context. And so I want to just give you an example. I'll just say this, an example I know quite well and is very familiar to me, um, of, of the potential power of these tests for better or worse. I know a student who was a National Merit Scholar. As a result of that, the student was accepted by default into a major university, and without any other application requirements other than submitting a transcript, the student was offered a complete full ride. And when I say full ride, we have to understand that means not just tuition, but tuition, housing, food, um, parking permit, all fees waived for orientation and everything, and a stipend for travel and a stipend for uh, study abroad. Okay. Um, and because the student didn't end up living in the dorms, they got a cash reimbursement from that amount of money. In addition, the student had earned outside scholarships that were non-tuition based, which resulted in an additional $10,000 a year, accumulating to a sum of about $15,000 to $16,000 a year, plus paying nothing to go to school. And it was all predicated on this one test. Another student I know well, hit the magic number at a public school and automatically, without any other requirements, was given full tuition ride. Right. So we see this in schools where, as I like to say, for some schools, and again we'll hit this point a lot tonight. It always depends on what school you're applying to. Every time, it always applies to what school you're applying to. Every school has its own set of rules, and we'll hit on this point more deeply later on. But for many schools, these tests can be forgive, so to speak, a lot of other challenges that may be in the application process. And they're also the quickest way for a school oftentimes to calibrate how they want to engage and relate to that student in terms of not just admissions into the school, but more specifically scholarships. So, exiting the classroom and entering the test zone. One of the elements that we have to think about with these tests is that the types of skills that you nurture and cultivate in the classroom do not translate well over to entering into the test zone. And so I want to just tell you, well, first I'll just touch on what I mean by the test zone. So there's content, like you need to know a linear equation, or you need to know how to use a comma or a semicolon, and it definitely helps to know that. But what you really have to understand for these tests are the skills, the strategy, and the mindset to perform well in these tests, because these tests are multiple choice questions. Multiple choice questions have a very particular psychology behind them. Very different from open-ended questions, which most students are usually very adept at doing. So a lot of students approach multiple choice questions as open-ended questions, which is not helpful for these tests. It slows you down and it creates a lot of mental extra load on the student. So knowing their multiple choice questions, understanding how to approach them, understanding it's a standardized test, understanding how you actually create a multiple choice question, very particular skills and strategies not cultivated and nurtured in the classroom. And then you have to have a particular mindset, very different from how, let's say, a classroom is graded a 100-point scale. You have to kind of invert that whole thinking in order to maximize your score. So when I talk about the test zone in the classroom, I'm talking about the skills that you nurture and acquire. And I'll just tell you a story to try to exemplify this. When I've done teacher trainings over the years, I'll give the full faculty, all departments and across the board, 5 very simple ACT math questions. Now, so you have 3 minutes to do these 5 questions. And the faculty inevitably are very frustrated because it makes them anxious. And, they don't, I don't make them obviously share their scores, but, they're worried at first, well, I'm going to tell what I got, I'm past this. I don't have to take these tests anymore. And so I say, begin. And then at 1 minute, I say you have a 1-minute warning. You can feel the stress. Some teachers put their pencil down and don't finish it. You get these various responses. And when they're done, they think we're going to go over the answers or how many they got right. And what I ask them to do is get in small groups and tell me, what skills did you need to do well on these 5 math questions? And it's always interesting because, I get a different sequence of ordering. I get the same response from teachers. They always give me, you have to be able to manage time. You have to be able to manage stress. You have to have a particular type of problem-solving skill capacity to answer these. I said, that's interesting. You're taking a math test. You didn't even mention the math. They're like, yeah. And I said, well, go ahead and give me a fourth skill you need to do well on these tests. And they don't say math, they say reading. Because the math questions tend to have a paragraph or words, vocabulary, math terms that may be difficult. And so we have to have good reading comprehension. So there you can see something different going on in terms of skills matchups, even on a math test. Now, certainly it's helpful to be good at math, but it's not good to be necessarily good at math in an analytical, procedural way. It's better to be good at math in a conceptual, abstract thinking kind of way. And so we can see that the classroom and the test zone kind of create an incongruency. So I'll give you an example. I had a student one time, a very wonderful student, very strong student, number 2 out of 600 in the student's class, which you would think that that's rather remarkable in a very competitive urban district. And within that context, the student was scoring a 21 on the ACT. So ACT is scored from 1 to 36, and 21 is the national average. There's nothing wrong with a score of 21 on the ACT, but most people would think if a student was number 2 out of 600 in their graduating class at that time, that they would probably be scoring higher. Okay. What became abundantly obvious is the student's skills were things like the student was incredibly conscientious, hardworking, impeccable attention to detail, diligent, resolved, all these wonderful skills, but they didn't quite translate over well to this test in terms of, the ability to have dexterity, to work off the back of a napkin, so to speak, to get the answer, to make positive, educated guesses, to move quickly. And so there was a skills incongruency. And then, sometimes people will ask me, well, there are these students who go in and they do exceptionally well on the test and they never prepared for them. How do they do well? And I've kind of come to my own conclusion about that over the years, which is unfortunate. But oftentimes these students never prepare for any test, so they've actually got quite good at not preparing for tests and figuring out how to do them. And so I tend to think that skill, while not enviable, does benefit them in a particular way in this context. So it's important here to my point here is that you have to be congruent with the skills necessary for these tests, and they're not always immediately obvious as to what they are unless you're dealing with someone who has a lot of experience with the test. So what does responsible preparation actually look like? Okay, so the way I've always thought of this is when I grow up, I want to score a perfect score. I want to score a perfect score on the ACT or SAT. I mean, no human has that goal. That is an absolutely ridiculous goal. Okay, so there's got to be something more to life than this test. And so the way that I try to talk to families about it is I call it the funnel approach. And it's not even what college are you going to, as to what score you need to get or how you need to think about these tests. I start in the very, very broadest, biggest picture context I can, which is with life goals. The student and the family, they need to think about what kind of person do you want to be when you grow up? How do you want to change the world? What kind of career do you want to pursue? Do you want to pursue a career, right? These are all life goals, big picture goals, and I strongly encourage you to write these down, whether you're a student or with your parents. To get these big life goals down, to get a long vision of your life ahead of you, so you can begin to align everything against it, including whether these tests are relevant for you and what kind of score you need to score. So then once you know your life goals, you can write down your college goals. What do you want to study in college? What activities do you want to participate in? With the understanding that those college goals actually align with your life goals. Okay, it's extremely important, this idea of alignment, in my experience over the last 20 years. So then once you have your life goals and your college goals, you can actually begin to discuss what colleges you ought to apply to. All right? Do you want to maintain a close proximity to your family to nurture and build that relationship, or do you intend to go far away? Well, that's a big question, and it certainly aligns and shifts the nature of the goals. If you look statistically on the number of people who go far off to college, how many come home, what the long-term relationships are with the family, et cetera, et cetera. So how you think about these questions are very important. So then you can begin to, once you have your life goals and college goals, what colleges you want to apply to. Once you actually know what colleges you want to apply to, then you can actually look at what the school expects in terms of admissions. And within that admissions, you can determine what they expect or do not expect from the ACT or SAT. And then you can actually set a test score goal and situate this text within the broader perspective of your life. And of course, if your life goals change, or any of the above goals, then you readjust and go through the funnel again, and that will help you be able to have I think, what I would call a responsible way to look at this test within the broader context of life, and not get kind of what I call the spaghetti noodle approach, which is you take a bunch of spaghetti and you hurl it against the wall. And part of that is I got to get as high a score as I possibly can on this test. And I've got to do as many community service hours as I possibly can. And I've got to, and all that time is being used and wasted and not directed toward a purpose. So goals should be written down. They should be concrete. They should be clear. And these tests need to align against those and be meaningful within that context. And so I just really encourage all of you, as you think about the relevance of the ACT or SAT, that you think about these bigger questions, and then work down to actually the colleges that are relevant to you, and then understand what the test score requirements are in relationship to those tests. And then from there, you can make a meaningful decision actually about how you prepare for these tests, and if you even need to. A lot of families, I'll be like, what are you trying to achieve? And they'll tell me. And then, they take a practice test and their score goals are already there. So I just, I'll joke. I say, well, go find a swimming pool and enjoy life. You don't need to prep. Other people are like, this is my goal. And if I can get 3 more points, I can get, $15,000 more dollars per year. And certainly the effort and time in relationship to the reward financially is worth it. It's hard to have college debt. It's hard to move out into the world having debt over you, especially if you're trying to start a family. And so, these are all questions we have to take into consideration. So what does quality preparation look like? So let's say you've gone through this funnel, your life goals, your college goals, your score goal, and now you're looking for quality preparation because you say, okay, look, everything lines up and I need to prepare for this test in a meaningful way, okay? Well, I think there's 2 things. First, you need an instructor who understands the necessary content, but more the skill, strategy, and mindset needed for test day. And I'll just say it. The test prep space tends to be kind of the bottom of the rung in education a lot of times. It's unfortunate, but it is. And there's a lot of aggressive marketing. There's a lot of price gouging in these spaces. And so you need to be careful as you're making these decisions. But really, you need to actually know not the company that's instructing your child. You actually need to know the person who's instructing your child, what their capacities are, right? And second, you need to know someone who both understands how to teach and understands these unique tests. So sometimes you have people who understand these tests really well, but they don't actually understand how to work with students. And they may have to work with like a gunner student, but they may not be able to work with a student maybe who has certain other types of needs, or is struggling in a certain area. So you really are looking for this unique combination. And usually teachers in the classroom don't really understand these tests because they're trained in the classroom. And so you're kind of looking for a niche space of someone who understands both how to teach students, how to instruct, but also understands these unique tests. And that's in particularly with relationship to the skill, strategy, and mindset. And just to note, a high test score does not necessarily know either of these 2. So a lot of companies will market, all of our instructors scored in the top 1% on the ACT or SAT. Well, that's fantastic, but we can see historically that, in sports, just because you're a great player doesn't make you a great coach. And we rarely ever ask teachers, what did you score on this or that or the other? And so we don't need to be confused about those. Now, it's not to say a high test score can't be a great instructor in the test prep space, but that alone certainly isn't sufficient. And so finally, a few thoughts on COVID-19 and the ACT and SAT. Yeah, I would just say, first of all, clearly the spring was disrupted. ACT and SAT had to suspend their tests through the spring, and then it kind of SAT all the way through the summer. ACT tried to work at a state level in certain ways, but it does raise questions for the fall in a variety of ways, depending on which state you're in and the health situation and the state regulations and protocols and guidelines, etc. I think what is abundantly obvious, and ACT and SAT have been working towards this for a while, that online testing will increasingly become available, right? SAT and ACT online testing will increasingly become available. They're, I think, scrambling very hard to make that movement that way. We see that a lot of colleges and universities have made adjustments for obvious reasons. They've said, that we don't require the test, and they need students, right? They're a business operation that needs money, and so if they required a test that's not available, how could anyone apply? I mean, that wouldn't make any sense. So they've made adjustments, and the question becomes, will that result in long-term adjustments or near-term adjustments? And so one of the principles I've always had with families, and it still holds in the COVID-19 situation, is you're not applying to college, you're not applying to a university. You're applying to specific colleges and universities, and you need to know the rules of the game in terms of how they operate. And so, just like before, but even more so now, if you're applying to college A, B, C, and D, I strongly, strongly recommend that you make a spreadsheet on like an Excel spreadsheet or something and write the name of the school in each column, and then go through or each row, however you want to organize it. And then in the other ones, put things like what is their tuition, what are their total housing and fees and hidden fees, what are their requirements for ACT and SAT, and not just for admissions, but also for scholarships. Some of these schools are saying things like, well, it's not required, in other words, for admissions, but it could still be required for scholarships. So it's kind of a tricky space. The other thing is, for example, some schools will super score, let's say the SAT, but they don't super score the ACT, which means you take all the times you take the test, you take the highest section test from each test. So, for example, if you took the ACT and you have English, reading, math, and science, and you took the ACT 3 times, they would look at the highest English, highest reading, highest math, and highest science, and then average those. Some schools super score both ACT and SAT. Some super score just one of them. A lot of schools have tiers for scholarships. If you get a 27, you get this amount of money. If you get a 30, you get this amount of money. Some schools put a lot of weight on National Merit Scholarship. Some schools don't put any weight on National Merit Scholarship. And all of that continues to kind of be in flux right now with COVID-19. And so what I would strongly encourage you, if you're going into your senior year right now, I mean, then, you've got a little, you've got to get your admissions kind of moving right now. If you're going into your junior year, then, you kind of have a year ahead of you to kind of see how things normalize and across the testing space. But if someone were to say, do you think this is a game changer? I would say, well, I mean, it could be disruptive, but just like with College Board with the AP exams, they moved them all online. So I think at a minimum, that's what you're going to see with the ACT and SAT. They're going to move online ultimately if they need to, because they're businesses. They're not going to want to just disappear. What are colleges and universities going to do? Well, they're going to do probably what's in their self-interest in order to make sure that they're keeping enrollment numbers strong. And within that context, I think if the ACT and SAT can probably normalize themselves and make sure that they're you know available, which online I'm pretty confident they will be, then they'll schools will make decisions based on that. So at the end of the day, I guess what I'm telling you is the same thing I've told families for years, which is you need to know the schools you're applying to. You need to communicate with them. You need to know exactly what they expect from you in terms of your admissions, so that you can make sure you're aligning with them and you're not wasting time and space um, um, preparing for things that you don't need, right? But I suspect, just given right now, the question that emerges is, if you don't have the ACT and SAT, what is the standard of comparison to get into college? Because class ranks, GPAs, and community service are not good ways to be able to figure out, because they vary so much. I mean, if you grew up in a small rural town versus a high power, elite suburban area or something like this, it's hard to compare GPAs. It's hard to compare class ranks. And so, in theory, the ACT and SAT were the great regulators, so to speak. So I suspect that they're gonna be present, and colleges right now are making adjustments because kids can't take them. But as they normalize, I suspect they probably will come back up, and you're seeing, I think, that right now. But that being said, I just tell parents you always need to talk to the schools you're applying to find out what they need. So I hope this time was valuable to you. I hope it gives you some things to think about as you move into the fall. Um, I will remind you, CLRC and I are partnering together for this fall with a course for the ACT SAT. It's a 7-week course. Early registration discount is going on right now. I am the instructor. Like I said, you all should know who your instructor is, and it's a course that'll build the foundation and strengthen students to get the skills, mindset, and the strategies they need in order to grow their score and reach their goals, which my hope is always that they service the broader goals of their life. So I'm grateful for your time and being able to be here today.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tarpley. And we do have time. If there are questions, you can put those questions in the Q&A pod there, and Dr. Tarpley can answer those. You can always reach him afterwards by email as well. And as he said, information is up on the last slide here for the CLRConline.com. If you go to that web address, you'll see his course there, the ACT SAT prep course. So any questions? And if not, just thank you again. Thank you, Dr. Tarpley. Thank you, those of you that came to listen today. And all the best as you move forward considering these tests and college admissions in the future.